Good evening. This is Open Book. I'm Richard Winham. My guests are two poets, one who has just published his first novel, and the other who has been a poetic monologuist in print and in plays for more than 30 years. My first guest is Andrew K. Clark. His family settled in North Carolina after landing in New Bern, North Carolina in 1739. We talked for a bit about the impact of Helene. He and his family are fine, he said, but they didn't anticipate having water for another month. But other than that, they have survived relatively unscathed. So then I was curious about his being part of a family who have lived in the same mountains in North Carolina for nearly 4 centuries. I'm trying to imagine what it's like to be so aware of your roots. Does that make you feel more stable? Does that allow you to let your imagination roam?
That's a great question. I think it makes me, I guess, connected to the place in a way that I think a lot of folks don't feel connected to a place, which is kind of a staple of Southern writers in general. You know, places often described as a character for Southern writers. And where I think the challenge comes in for Southern writers is to tell the truth of a place. So I think our biggest obligation, Appalachian writers, Southern writers, maybe any writer, is to tell the truth. So we live in this beautiful place. We kind of think of it as a little bit magic, sometimes haunted. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountain range on Earth. And so there's all this sort of mysticism wrapped up in the way that we talk about them and think about them. But I think, again, kind of getting to the meat of it is the need to tell the truth. So while we have this beauty, while we have this sort of magical landscape, we also have like the Southern history that we have to reckon with. And so to me, I think our biggest burden is to tell the truth. So I think to get back to your question, I do feel very connected to the place and the people, but also that connection allows me to see the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. And I have to be honest about the ugly.
There are so many things I admire about the South, many of which I think I admired before I came here and before I realized anything very much about the South. The wonderful storytelling that seems to be indigenous here and the mythology that goes along with it.
Yes.
So what you were just talking about, and somebody talking about this part of the world, as you were just saying, it was settled by Protestant Christians, Scots Irish, German, and Scandinavian. And then they went on to say, but they also embraced, while they were Protestant Christians, they also embraced folk beliefs from the old world. So the
Correct.
notion of fairies and sprites and creepy crawlies in the night, that's always been a part of Southern mythology, hasn't it?
Yeah, so we have this long history of sort of cryptid ideas in the Appalachian Mountains, and but a lot of the people that I grew up listening to, sort of the elders, the folks that were like my grandparents' age. My grandparents were teenagers during the Great Depression, and so that may be one reason that I was drawn to sort of write about this. It always was very fascinating to me hearing about how they grew up and the way they struggled. They were very poor people, but there was this mixture of religion with superstition. So you would have like an elderly woman in church who would throw out something about, throwing salt over your shoulder or whatever the case may be, just right alongside talking about her faith. So they did not see like the separation between their faith and this sort of mysticism that you're talking about, the sprites and the fairies and all those things. So I think it's kind of rich for storytellers, and I do think Appalachia is a place where there's a man of a certain age in Appalachia, like you can't ask a question without getting a story. It's just sort of ingrained in them. So I come from a long line of storytellers, not necessarily putting it down on paper, but my granddad could tell, he could describe going to the mailbox and make some kind of epic story out of it and reference it to, something that happened in history, or it was just remarkable the way he could string together ideas.
There's a similar kind of mythology in the UK, that notion of an Arcadian past. Tolkien tapped into that a lot.
Yes, absolutely. And
And you're
that
a fan
is
of his, right? Yeah.
one of my early influences would be, as a middle school kid, reading a lot of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. So I connected a lot with what they were doing, sort of the mythologies and things they created, the world building and so forth. I just absolutely love that. And my middle grade years, and obviously still love to read, reread those books from time to time.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. There's a heavy element of that in Harry Potter too. It's the same kind of thing, really, in some ways.
That's
Uh,
right. Right. It's a
Slightly
continuation.
different approach, but
Yeah,
the root
absolutely.
of it is the same. That magical realism in Harry Potter. Um, I guess I grew up with C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe,
Yes.
Toad of Toad Hall, uh,
Yes.
Wind in the Willows,
Hmm.
which then Pink Floyd took. It was very much, a part of that whole cultural, it was an explosion really in the 60s. That kind of, I guess it's the idea that there was a kind of purity and an innocence in previous, before the country became industrialized.
Yes. And obviously Tolkien is reckoning with that.
Mm.
He's sort of defender of the trees. He would even, there's several quotes attributed to him, you know, whatever happens, I'm with the trees, as if it was like, nature versus modernity in a way. And I think that is the same sort of feeling in Appalachia. So there's sort of progress. If you take a city like Asheville, which has become like very popular. I mean, for decades, it's been a very popular vacation spot, a place to come and spend time and hike and you know canoe down the river, like all those different kinds of things. And then also very popular in terms of folks moving here, retiring here, things like that, which is great. But at the same time, there's this little bit of tension because you have, like a very frothy real estate market where locals can't stay and work. Growing up here and straight out of college, like it's very difficult to make enough money to actually live here. And it's like a city. It's not unlike San Francisco in the fact that our police officers and teachers have to, commute in. They can't afford to live in the city. So there's on the one hand that progress and some good comes with that. You have like a more uh, diverse population, which is great. And then there's that sort of little bit of harkening back to the way things were. And also, in my case, sort of feeling like I want my people to be able to stay here and live here and, my kids and things like that and not have to go somewhere else because it's too expensive.
This is Open Book. My guest is Andrew K. Clark, who has just published his first novel. It's called Where Wild Things Grow. This is Andrew reading from the novel.
Prologue, Spring 1927. The big man walked the two women up the mountain through the woods, black sack hoods over their faces. His large hands gripped each by the shoulder as they came on. They knew not where they were going, but they knew who took them there. The last face they saw before the darkness, a broad, fleshy skull with deep-set green eyes, a face so wrinkled and drawn it resembled that of a troll from a child's fairy tale book. In the distance, a cluster of old trees, their dark trunks thick, their limbs full of vibrant black leaves. Beyond the trees, men rolled large rocks in place to finish the walls of an enormous structure at the edge of the mountain. The sound of hammer striking steel echoed through the woods and in the ears of the women in sackcloth. The big man stopped them in front of another wearing a dark blue suit, black tie, and many rings on each hand. The big man bore heavily down on the women's shoulders, forcing them to their knees. One of the women whimpered quietly. The other was silent. The man in blue was shorter, but still quite tall, perhaps 6 feet. He had broad shoulders and wore a gray top hat. Dark eyes, almost black. He took off the hat and set it carefully on the forest floor. He straightened his tie and ran his fingers through his thick black hair, pushing it back out of his eyes. "Let me to see them," he said, his deep voice a strange accent unknown to the women. The big man pulled off the sacks. The women blinked their eyes against the bright spring sun. The man in blue looked at each in turn. He held their faces in his black-gloved hand, examined their hair, short and brown on one, long and blond on the other. He forced their mouths open and looked at their teeth, pulled at their tongues, and ran his fingertips slowly over their pale, bare necks. "Quite hardy," he said, nodding to the big man, who grunted a response. He took a knee in front of the women. "Fret not, my dear beauties," he said. He opened his hands, and a blue flame formed there in his palms. The girl with short hair gasped. The blue flame became a lovely painted butterfly before their eyes. It fluttered its wings, and the blonde girl smiled briefly before remembering her circumstance. He stood the blonde girl up and slowly undressed her. Some of the men stopped their work to gaze upon her before he cut his dark eyes at them, and they quickly turned away. Harsh purple bruises marred her back and ribs, and he traced them with his fingers as she winced. He slid a cotton yellow dress over her and cinched it in the front. He carefully painted her lips red. When she was ready, he took both of her hands in his own. He said, "It will hurt for a moment only." He spun in circles with her the way an adult might swing a child. Her feet left the ground and they moved together for a moment before he released her into the air. The woman screamed and flew back first toward one of the large trees behind her. The immense tree cracked violently open, curving its limbs as if to offer her a lover's embrace. The bark itself spread open, the grain of the tree as pink flesh inside. She disappeared into the trunk, and the bark closed around her body, her muffled cries audible only briefly before silence. The girl with short hair screamed and found her feet to run. The man in blue caught her quickly. He spun her body against his chest and released her toward a second tree. It spread open and quickly received her, then closed. The man in blue walked over to his hat on the ground, retrieved it, returned it again to his head. To the big man he said, "I am well pleased, but many will be needed. The trees are full of hunger."
My guest, Andrew K. Clark, reading from the prologue from his first novel, Where Dark Things Grow. The novel is set in the mountains of North Carolina during the Great Depression. The protagonist in the story, Leo, lives with his family in what amounts to a mountain shack, but despite his fairly meager resources, he's nevertheless determined to rescue the young women described in the prologue. That's a fascinating period in history, the Great Depression. Walker Evans photographs and all that show life as unimaginably bleak. But for Leo and his family, it's really hard to imagine how people survive that kind of situation. They don't really seem to have very many resources.
Yeah, and again, I know that the sort of immediate inspiration for wanting to write about the period was the fact that my grandparents grew up here in that time period. And one of the things that always fascinated me was, they did really struggle. They had a lot of difficulty. They were tenant farmers. They rented their homes. They had to move around a lot, things like that, trying to find work. But one thing that I always felt about the story that's told about Asheville in the Great Depression is this notion of this Gilded Age, right? So there's this huge boom in Asheville in the 1920s. There's rampant real estate speculation. You hear these stories of, in New York when the stock market crashed in 1929 of people throwing themselves out of windows. Well, that actually happened in downtown Asheville, right? So because people had leveraged themselves multiple times under the assumption that real estate could not lose value, right? And it couldn't go down, right? It was a no lose situation. So they lost everything, and their families and so forth. So we had people jump out of, we don't have the skyscrapers, but we had people jump out of our tall buildings and things like that. But what always was sort of struck me was there was this story of this big rise, this big Gilded Age. The Vanderbilts come here in the 1890s and they build the Biltmore House, and there's this rise, and then this precipitous fall. So Asheville collapses, right? The real estate market collapses. The city is doesn't go bankrupt, but it has a tremendous amount of debt. Actually took the city of Asheville until the 1970s to pay off the debt from the 1920s
Hmm.
because of the loss in value of so many of the investments they made. But in that story of Asheville being this place where there was this Gilded Age, this rise and fall, and hearing my grandparents talk about living here in that time period, poor folks, if you went out to a sort of rural area outside of Asheville, um, nothing changed for them, right? They were poor before the Great Depression happened. Great Depression happens, and nothing literally changes for them. Matter of fact, my granddad would say that their lives got better because of the Great Depression because his father got a job at the TVA and was able to send money home. So that story, in other words, that story of sort of the wealthy Gilded Age Asheville, I feel like had been told quite often. And the Fitzgeralds were here, during that time, and but the sort of story of the rural folks, I didn't feel like, or the poor folks that were living here, I didn't feel like that had been told. So that was part of what attracted me to telling this story. And so that's where my joke about the book is it's a failed short story. I tried to write a short story about my grandparents' existence, and it wound up being a novel because I just had sort of too much to say. But I wanted to kind of capture some of that hard scrabble life that they had and tell their story. And also important to me when I first started is trying to capture something of the vernacular, the language that they use, the language they spoke in. So if you had the opportunity to listen to my grandparents talk, it's a little bit diluted when you talk to my father's generation. And then when you get to my generation, it's even more diluted. And then as you talk to my kids, you may not even think they come from Appalachia, right? You may not detect, that's much of an accent there, right? A few words maybe.
Hmm.
So I wanted to capture that and sort of get that down on paper, that way that they talked and the way they saw the world. So not only just the language they used and the phrasings, which were peculiar to our modern ears, but also, as you said earlier, there's sort of mixture of the lens they saw the world in through like spiritual eyes, their sort of faith, and then the superstitions they had.
Hmm.
So that's what attracted this period to me in terms of writing the story.
So, just to clarify for people who haven't read the book, the character at the center of the story is Leo. He lives with his mother, two brothers, and his sister. And they have lost one brother. Is that right?
They've lost a brother who's passed away, and then Leo's dad goes missing. So
Mm.
he sort of finds himself needing to be a breadwinner for the family to help provide, and then his mother begins to struggle with what we call today, mental illness. And so Leo's not in a good place when the novel opens. And one of the things that I thought was fun to play with in the novel is this idea of like a sort of completely helpless person, right? So Leo's not only poor, has no agency or status in the world that he lives in, but also he's 15, so the adults don't even take him seriously, right? He's a kid, right? So and against that backdrop, one of the things I do in the story is he does encounter these magical enchanted wolvers, and realizes that he can control, at least he thinks he can control one of them. And so wolvers are these, sort of big wolves that maybe as big as a horse, but can walk around on their hind legs. And they actually come from Scottish folklore, which is where one decision I made early on in the story is just to use, any sort of supernatural things I introduce. I want it to come at least from something in my ancestry, as opposed to, something that's not related to my personal background. And so, but the fun thing about the novel for me and writing it and telling the story is what happens when someone who has no power suddenly has tremendous power. So we see in Leo this journey where he starts off in a very benevolent fashion. Oh, I'm going to use this to feed my family and take care of everybody. And I'm going to, he has all these good intentions. And then he starts to turn and realize, oh, the people that haven't treated us very well, I could punish them if I wanted to. And so he goes down kind of a dark path. And that's really the important arc in the story is, can he get out of this dark place with this, magical power, this sort of like vengeance that he's trying to unleash on the world. And again, there's always that question of like, is he really in control, or is something in control of him? So that's part of, his struggle. But I think the book tries to address that sort of problem of power. We have lots of things we say about power. We say, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that really is the big struggle of the book. And so it's a coming of age story with Leo at 15, sort of growing into a man, but using sort of supernatural elements to kind of speak to the things that we struggle with in that journey from childhood to adulthood.
It's also, I think, at the core of the story, the role of women in the culture in that period. Um, they
Yes.
are definitely second class. I think part of Leo's anger is rooted in his mother, who
Mhm.
has treated, as far as I can tell, has been treated rather badly by his father. I think his father maybe is one of those people who is a victim of the time. Maybe his skill set didn't fit the few jobs that were available.
Mhm.
He turns to alcohol because it's a way to make himself feel better, I guess. But that alcohol takes him away from the family. And Leo's angry about that because he sees his mother suffering, and his brothers, are the sort of stereotypical loafers, the way that Appalachian people are often portrayed.
Mhm.
Before I came down here, people would talk about barefoot people smoking pipes and all that sort of thing. Which,
Right.
frankly, I've been here 50 years. I've never seen anybody barefoot or smoking a pipe like that. But
Right. Yeah.
but but the character of Lilyfax
Mhm.
is a wonderful contradiction of that stereotype. She's proto-feminist,
Right.
a tomboy. She's happy. I mean, I feel like I've always known you, says Leo, and Lilyfax says, it's the same for me when I look at you. We ain't boyfriend and girlfriend. Let's get that clear.
Yeah.
She's
That's right.
she's
That's
gonna
right.
maintain her independence.
Lilyfax was the most fun character to write because she's a tomboy, as you say. She's full of a little bit of fire, a little bit of vinegar. She's a lot of what Leo wants to be. And as the story opens, again, he's this character with no agency. He doesn't really have a voice. Here in her, he sees someone who has a very clear voice and a very clear worldview. And she, in the beginning of the story, she has to come to his rescue. She has to help him. And I would argue that she helps him throughout the story, even though even at times when he thinks he is uh, you know, the person who's saving someone, right? I would argue that she's always kind of playing that role, but she was the most fun to write, and is sort of like his best friend. She becomes a love interest over the course of the story, but yeah, in writing about this time period, like one of the things you have to reckon with is there is rampant misogyny,
Hmm.
right? There's rampant racism. So the Klan makes an appearance in this book, and doing sort of research about Asheville in that time period. It was a big hub for Klan rallies. Asheville, the city of Asheville, like downtown, big hub for that organization and their hate. And so I think what I hope readers take away from the book is, I am trying to reckon with that misogyny, with that racism, but also I think the book has a lot to say about class, because as we see in the book, Leo and his people, when they are there's a scene that I love in the story when they're walking through Asheville. So they're in Asheville in sort of that Gilded Age, that time period, and Leo says, as the men pass, they all nod at each other, except no one nods at his father, right? So you sort of picture the country bumpkin, the rural man walking through town, holes in his shoes, things like that. Like they don't even see him. He does not exist. And so, again, just based on the time period, I thought, I've got to sort of include these elements. And in the story, there's also this thread of women being kidnapped, and that is a rampant problem even today. It's not something unique to what was happening at that time, but women were being kidnapped and basically trafficked, and that's a theme in the book. So Leo gets pulled into an attempted rescue effort because one of the women that he meets in the course of the story is kidnapped, and unfortunately, we still see that happening today. Atlanta is a big hub for human trafficking. And as much as we want to think we've made a lot of progress, we haven't. And so one thing that I tried to do in the story is not just portray those characters as victims with no voice. And so there are some chapters from their points of view, so we get a sense of who they are as people and that they matter. And they're not just a vehicle for like a storytelling device, if you will, right? I didn't want them to be cardboard cutouts or things we see on your true crime documentary on HBO or whatever. They play a big role in the story in shaping who Leo becomes, and also in ultimately their own destinies.
The book by Andrew K. Clark is called Where Dark Things Grow. For the balance of the program, the first of a two-part conversation with my friend Peggy Douglas, who has been writing to give voice to people who have no voice in the wide cultural sense, much like the people that Andrew K. Clark is writing about. I guess people write for any number of different reasons, but I've seen people recently talking about that one of the motives for writing, whatever the plural of impetus is to make a change in the world.
Yes. I started out writing poetry and getting poetry published, but who reads poetry books? Not many. So and I also had been collecting oral histories for 30 years and turning those oral histories into poetic monologues. And I would publish them or perform one here and there. And then I thought, no, these really need to be performed on stage. And I think people are going to be changed by hearing these stories, and they're true stories. So what I do now is I think of a theme, and then I ask for advice from different groups around town on who I should interview. Like I just did one on gun violence survivors. So I talked to people from all over town and got a list of people. And I was taught at the Highlander Folk School about oral history pedagogy. Not to go in with equipment, not to go in with a lot of questions. Just go in and say, I know you're a gun violence survivor. What would you like me to know about you? And 2 or 3 hours later, I have a story. So I take the story and convert it into a poetic monologue and take it back to the storyteller. And when they're happy with it, I'll hire a director and she'll cast the actors. And it's performed on stage, and the storytellers sit in the front row so they can hear their stories told back to them.
For a while, I don't remember how long it was, but for a while I worked with the people who work with veterans, listen to their stories and then turn them into a song.
Yeah, similar. Similar.
It sounds as if, well, the reason that occurred to me was because you said the people that you've written the stories about are in the front row.
Yes.
And that, that approach to therapy is, it's that interesting when you take something that's deeply personal to someone and you make it, it's as if you take that which is rendered in the first person and put it in the third person. So then that person can stand outside what they're hearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe as a result of that, they hear it differently and they see themselves differently.
Yeah. I mean, we usually hold the talk back too. And a lot of people in the audience yesterday, when they heard the gun violence survivor stories, they said, oh, that happened to me, that happened to my brother. So it's not only a validation to the storytellers, but to people in the audience as well.
And do you find people who have told you these stories are open to talking with people in that kind of situation, with people they've never met before, come and hear the play, and does that spark a conversation after the play?
Oh, yeah. And the actors talk about what it was like to perform somebody's story that's sitting there in the front row. And the storytellers talk about, what was it like to hear my story told back in front of a whole audience? But I've never had anybody say, I wish I hadn't done that.
No, I'd be really surprised if you did. Because your approach is first of all, is so empathetic as well as sympathetic, and it's not judgmental.
Oh no.
And if we were to talk about your collection that you've just published, We Speak, this is a compilation of projects under different topics. The question that you begin with is very broad. Do you find that it helps to use prompts, or is it better if you don't use prompts?
Well, the way I was taught, if I use prompts, then I'm in charge. And I want the storyteller to be in charge. So I just trust the process. And, I'll listen for 2 or 3 hours. And so through that, I will have captured a narrative arc with a beginning, middle, and end. And it works. I don't know how.
I don't either. That's really interesting. There's a natural narrative arc every time.
Yes.
Even when, if we begin at the beginning, the first person you talk to is identified as Orphan Girl. She's in
Silverdale Detention Center, yeah.
She was abandoned by her parents. Mm-hmm. She was driving under the influence of drugs. And while she was driving a car, was that her car she was driving?
I think it was her car.
So she was just high.
She had been kind of taken off the streets by a man that was a drug dealer. And so he had her selling drugs, and he got her addicted. And whether she was driving his car, I'm not so sure.
It's as if we jump right in at the deep end. This is a harrowing story. It's appalling to think that should happen to anyone. She was still prepubescent when she was introduced to drugs.
Yes.
She was, at the time you spoke to her, still in her teens, wasn't she?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And sold on the street as well.
And perhaps one of the most poignant remarks she makes is when she says she's glad to be in prison because nobody's hitting on her.
Right.
Nobody
Right.
wants to use her.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. And then at the same time, she hadn't gone to trial yet. You know, she was looking at possibly the majority of her life in prison. And that was so daunting. You know, at 22 years old, being in prison for the rest of your life.
So she was just past teenage at that point.
Yeah.
And she's in Silverdale, which is just a detention centre, isn't it? It's not a prison.
No, but sometimes they're there for like 3 years. And
but where they'd be sending her would be a
Nashville.
federal facility?
Or the state facility in Nashville.
Oh, the state facility. What's that like? It's a hardcore prison, I guess.
It's pretty hardcore. Yeah. Mm.
I mean, I can only speak from my own experience. At 22, I was still a kid. You know.
Yeah, we were pretty innocent.
Yeah. So while it's apparent she isn't, she's had all kinds of experiences that now it's kind of hard for me to imagine. Still, the prospect of going to prison and the life that she's likely to, the kind of life she's going to have in a hardcore prison.
Yeah, and
how was she doing anything to prepare herself for that?
No, she just couldn't even go there. I mean, the only thing that really gave her some ease was a Bible class that she was taking, and that somehow she was able to grab on to that, and, that lifted her spirit. So, you have to have a real short time frame, just not think about the future. It's kind of a survival thing, because at first the people weren't even very nice to her. And she had to find a kind of a posse that would look after her.
Oh, I guess it's not that much different than being on the street, really.
Yeah, true. Yeah, we all do.
The second one, which is kind of a partner piece, is called Pure Gravy, about, again, a young woman. But this is a young woman who has a time frame on her imprisonment. She's in prison for 5 years.
Right.
She was a prostitute.
Lost her son. Really, she said the best thing that ever happened to her was when she got arrested, because it stopped that life, and she was really at the bottom.
Well, she was abandoned by the people who said they loved her. That's her blood family.
Yeah. And that's a pretty
then
typical.
She found herself getting involved with men who didn't care about her.
Yeah.
But is that, at least in part, I guess, because she didn't care about herself?
Well, or sometimes, it gives you a meal, it gives you a place to be, and if they get you hooked on some kind of drugs, then you have to.
So it's survival again.
Yeah, it's survival. Yeah.
And as you said, and as she said, prison was a respite from
street
life on the street.
Yeah. And then they do have recovery programs at Silverdale, so she was able to get into recovery, and that was kind of what she held on to in prison. And now I've seen her lately. She has a job. She has her child back. She takes care of her grandchild. I think she's 5 years sober. So it's, you can recover. She's living proof.
I think the most appalling thing in my mind is that we take it for granted that we have personal space. And if somebody invades our personal space, we're really fairly quick to respond to it. She has no personal space.
There's none. At least while I was doing the interview, some of them hadn't been outside for 3 years, and they're just packed in a dormitory.
What do they do all day?
Well, they do have some activities, but it's pretty boring. Yeah.
I'm really drawn to this Finnish program where they give inmates, they're able to leave for the weekend.
Yeah.
And they send them out into the community to work. the notion of, and I guess, I forget what that thing was called now, the guy that invented that prison that was open on all sides so that people could watch them 24/7. I forget what the name of it is.
I remember that.
It's like the 18th century, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That again, comes back to that same idea that you deprive people of the most basic right to have autonomy. That's even worse because you don't even have any. There's people watching you all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And they are. They are, and there's cameras and.
So even though they didn't necessarily adopt his design, they adopted his concept that somebody who's imprisoned should essentially be observed constantly.
Yes. Yes.
But very little attempt at rehabilitation.
None. The only is the kind of religious programs that go on there. I think that's all comes in from the outside. And, they're real careful when we go in to make sure we're trained and we don't carry pins and...
Anything that could be used as a weapon?
Yeah. Do
you think that's a possibility?
Oh, it happens all the time.
Does it really?
Yes.
Why?
Yeah, I mean...
Because they're so angry?
Well...
I mean, how's that going to benefit them to do that?
How would you feel if you were in a concrete cell, or actually it's a dormitory block, and you had nothing to do? I mean, but probably argue or, take your frustration out on your neighbor. I mean, I could really... I did, for about a year, teach poetry. And that was good because that was something that they could do. They have certain kind of pencils that they can use that aren't hard. So they enjoyed writing.
The title of your book is Voices from Chattanooga's Disregarded. But the people that you talk about in the beginning of your book, more than disregarded, in my mind, seem to be discarded.
Yeah.
They never had a shot to begin with.
Yeah, especially the incarcerated.
Yeah,
totally.
There's an almost inevitability about the cycle of their lives. Virtually from the time they're born, it's as if they're marked. They have so few opportunities.
Yeah, and it's all linked to poverty. I mean, the one about Mama's Boy, his mom had to work in a mall in North Georgia. And she didn't have anything to do with her children except just take them to the mall and let them run around the mall during the day.
Well, she was working 2 jobs, wasn't she?
Yeah. So
she's working effectively 16 hours a day.
Right.
And if she's sleeping for 8 hours, that pretty much takes care of every day, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And so her children... he's 12 years old at the time you talked to him, is that right? Or
no. He was grown.
Accident occurred.
He was reflecting on, Well, they never had any supervision because their mom had to work. And so eventually when he got to be like an adolescent, he left the mall and just would go out on the streets during the day and that's when he got in trouble.
Viva Las Vegas is under shifters and boppers. Shifters and boppers are people who work shift work?
Yeah.
What's a bopper?
Somebody that works in a textile mill.
Ah.
So I worked in a textile mill during college. And that was the hardest work I've ever done. I was on the line. At the time, it was just like the mills that were in Chattanooga. This was in Knoxville. And at the time, they were making T-shirts with numbers on them. So the T-shirt would pass down the line, and I'd have to put the number on the jersey real quick. And we were paid piecemeal. So if I held up the line, the women got really mad at me.
So it's a fully knitted jersey.
Yeah.
And how do you get the number to stay on?
Silk
Do you
screen.
have to iron it on?
No, it's silk screen paint. It's got paint, and you paint it on there.
Paint it?
Yeah, and then somebody's down there drying it. Yeah. So I fell in love with the mill workers and their stories. So that's what got me to interview people in Chattanooga during the 1950s that worked in the mills and the steel factories.
So just so I understand this, so it's like a conveyor belt?
Yeah.
And the jersey is laid flat on the
Right,
conveyor belt?
right.
And you're filling in a template for the number?
Yeah.
With some sort of fabric paint?
Yeah, exactly.
And how much time do you have to paint it?
Not much. It was definitely a learned skill.
It must be, because aside from anything else, there's always the danger that it might drip.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did that matter? Did they care about that?
Oh, yeah.
So they expected you to be precise.
Right.
But at the same time, how many of these jerseys did you do in a day?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. But it was kind of like a stencil, so you couldn't really get out of the lines. It wasn't.
Oh, so you paint within the stencil.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah.
Even so.
I know.
Aside from anything else, that's unbelievably monotonous.
Ugh.
So you have to do
and
that
hot
all day long.
In the summer, no air conditioning.
Oh.
Yeah. But they, here's the difference. I knew I could get out of that life. Yeah. They couldn't, right, because they were born into it and that's all they ever knew. But there was the other thing that was so beautiful about it was the essence of the community, like a mill village. Typically they had doctor's offices and post offices and maybe a swimming pool, and it was a totally contained village. And they had a post office in the middle that everybody walked to in the afternoon. So everybody knew everybody. As the saying goes, you could spit off the front porch and hit 4 houses if you had the wind.
It's so feudal.
Yeah.
So this man, Larry, the poor man has died and nobody even notices for a while.
No, Larry was kind of older, and they kind of let him sit and rest a while. And so he hadn't moved in a couple of hours. And so somebody went by and nudged him and he didn't move. And they realized he'd passed away. So there was the woman that I interviewed loved Larry. He was the only person that Larry would talk to. And every time he talked, he would talk about the actress Anne Margaret. And so my friend gave a eulogy at his funeral and said, well, I don't know a lot about him, but I do know he loved Anne Margaret.
Well, I thought that was so cool. It was so humanizing. That lady saw him, knew more about him than his wife did.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Would you care to read part of that story?
Sure. I'll read the last part. The closest thing Larry had to a hobby was Anne Margaret. I tell you what, Lucy, he said, that star looks better at 50 than you in your 20s. Remember her movie where Betty Davis is a homeless old drunk who writes letters to her daughter? That's Anne Margaret pretending to be a high society lady. Betty Davis pulls it off to the end. It's the only movie I ever saw where lying was the best policy.
And then there's a kind of partner piece to that about a woman who apparently works as a waitress on third shift.
Yeah.
Night shift. She works in a diner.
I have to say, some of these are a little autobiographical, because I worked at a late night shift in a diner one time, and you get a little glassy-eyed, towards the end of the shift. And that's when the people are getting off second shift. I didn't work very late, but like 11 o'clock when they were getting off.
Yeah, you can only imagine what it's like to do that overnight.
Oh, yeah.
Which is what this poor woman was doing.
Yeah.
And really, the only thing that keeps her going is the thought that she's going to be able to leave in the morning and do something else.
Yeah.
That for a moment she could be alive again.
Yep. She was working for the money.
Yeah.
And, survival.
So it would seem fair to say then that this is if one were to summarize the lives of most of the people you're writing about, it's survival rather than living.
Yep. I mean, that's why I write. You ask. I want to give voice to people that are not often heard.
I love the story about the lumberjacks. That was a story that you have such a wonderfully graphic way of describing things. Here's this man. He's got a razor-sharp axe.
And he's hopping around around the tree.
I'm trying to imagine how they're doing that. They're on some sort of board?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're on. Yeah.
And the board is, how's the board supported?
The board's supported by some ropes.
So the board hangs?
Yeah.
So they're on a swing bridge kind of thing?
Yeah.
With a razor-sharp axe in
Yeah,
there.
and he's cutting off the branches. And then eventually, when he cuts off all the side branches, they'll cut the whole tree down.
So he had a second tool along with the axe, right?
At some point. The thing he put around his stomach. Hold on. That's how he held himself, the safety.
Yeah, you said he buried the axe in the tree so he could hold on, and while he's holding on with that, he's using his other hand to cut the tree.
Exactly.
So it's not only a feat of agility, but it's also incredibly dangerous.
Oh, I can't imagine how dangerous. Yeah. And then, of course, he had an accident.
Would you care to share it?
So this is when he's standing on the board and going around the tree. To move along, they give a hop with one toe held under the springboard to swing it. Then they'd stick the axe in the wood and swoop to reach their straws. I never heard of one who fell, but one time a man turned to reach his saw and brushed that razor-sharp axe. It slid his middle right down the belt line for about 8 inches. Didn't bleed so much, but his intestines leaped down like bunning. And when they came with the stretcher, this man was under the cut, crouched on his knees, delicately holding up his gut loops one by one, splashing sawdust off them with water from his water bag. I'm telling you, there's no men like that today.
Well, we can only hope there isn't. It's not that I think necessarily that he was so unusual. Obviously he wasn't. For his time, that was what was expected of him, so he tried to rise to those expectations.
Yeah.
So I think what interests you, and it certainly fascinates me, hearing the stories from people who are trapped. Well, it's a remarkably empathetic undertaking. And I'm wondering if they feel somehow recognized because of the work you do. Do you get that sense from people when you've talked to them?
I think they don't get so much recognized when I collect their story. But when somebody performs their story on stage, they are beaming. I'll have to email you one I just got this morning from somebody from yesterday. I think you're such an interesting person. I'll sit here for as long as you want and listen to you.
Yes.
Because it's fascinating.
And what a gift that is.
Yeah.
Aside from anything else, even if you weren't writing it up, even if you weren't ultimately having other people perform these stories that they are telling you, you're listening to them.
Yeah, and you have to listen with your heart, because they can tell if you're just listening and you're thinking about something else. Or
They're so used to that.
Yeah. So I don't even look away. I've learned to take notes while I'm still have eye contact with them. But, yeah.
And gender has no role in this. Doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman.
No.
Treated the same way.
Oh, yeah.
With the same sense of, no sense of self, really.
Well, with the gun violence show, I interviewed a homicide detective. And he just broke down and talked about all the times his heart broke. And here was somebody you'd think was he is rough and tough in his job, but he also has a real soft side.
Really?
Yeah. And that's why I interviewed him. They call him the Mr. Rogers of the police department. Yeah.
So what sustains him?
His faith. The last thing he said to me was, you may wonder why I do this, but it's my calling, and I'll take my piece in that.
What exactly is his calling?
Help people.
To help people who've committed a crime, a violent crime?
Well, more, he has a lot of compassion for the moms of the people that are killed, or he just told me things I never thought about, like, if there's a crime in a crime-ridden part of the city, nobody wants to come forth and testify. And so it's hard for him to get closure.
Is he identified in that community as a policeman? He can't go in there without being identified.
Yeah, he's a detective. They know him. Most of the kind of homicides do happen in more of the low-income communities, and the suicides happen a lot more in the more affluent communities. And the biggest thing is guns that aren't secured.
Yeah.
I don't know if you call it accident or negligent.
Well, I think violence also, if you put rats in too tight a situation, they'll turn on each other, won't they?
Yeah.
And people do the same thing.
Yep.
This is what you were saying before,
Like the
about
prison.
the people who've been incarcerated.
Mm-hmm. It's survival.
Or not.
Yeah.
I guess it comes down to how does one define survival? Is survival simply that you're still breathing, or is it that you have what we call a soul?
I think it's just subsistence living. But, I know a lot of the people that I interview that, live in poverty, they have to have some sort of spiritual base to uplift them.
It's a way of keeping people enslaved by giving them some kind of panacea.
Well, I once had the privilege of talking to Bernice Johnson Reagan that led the Freedom Singers. And they were the first ones to get the dogs turned on them and the water hoses. And, I said, weren't you scared? And she said, when I'm doing my work with God and I'm with my people, if they kill me, that's their trip. So there was something about that spirit. And she would talk of, there were times in the civil rights movement when, they were raided by whomever, the Klan or the police, and they would start singing and, spirituals. And it was so powerful that the police would actually back up.
The book, a collection of poetic monologues by my guest Peggy Douglas, is called We Speak, Voices from Chattanooga's Disregarded. The second part of our conversation will be on the first of next month's 2 open book programs. I'm Richard Winham. I hope you'll join me then. Thanks so much for listening. Good night.